Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and it's rather late in the day, but I wanted to try to squeeze in a quick feeding because I've just spent a couple days out of town and I'm going to be out of town for the next few days. And when I looked at the stats on these couple of bins, these two here on the bench, the 366-day-old bin and the 348-day-old bin, which have both been in the process of migrating for the past 30 days, seemed to me like I should probably pop in here really quick before I go away again for the next few days, just to reinforce the feeding, just to also check it on the material that was left more or less uncovered to dry, because I think drying has also helped a lot by agitating and stirring the material up. So I think perhaps the stirring up of the material over on this side is my main goal today. But as long as I'm down here, I figured I would also do away with a few days worth of coffee I've got laying around, and I just replenished my supply of worm chow, so that's what they're getting, maybe even a little bedding. And then when we get down to the next two bins, a couple of twin bins that are both the same age, it's been 11 days since those bins were last fed, and what they were fed was a pretty meager feeding, and it did seem like I should really give them a little something to help tie them over until some other time when we can really treat their feeding as a normal feeding and give them a good portion. But what they're getting today is really just going to be a small amount to help tie them over. So I think to begin, we'll actually do a little bit of stirring over on the finished compost side, which is this side over here. Stuff's been sitting out here uncovered now since the last check-in, which was 9 days ago. And the material out on the top surface is getting pretty dry. The reason we wanted to let this stuff start to dry was because we found that the migration of the worms out of this material was seeming to take perhaps a little longer than anticipated, and we were starting to chalk that up to possibly the fact that the material was just so damp and comfortable that the worms were simply not motivated to exit the material. So we thought that by allowing this stuff to shed a little bit of its moisture, we might, as a result, find that the migration would work a little bit better and that the worms would start moving out. And, maybe the real thing to do in a case like this is to come back more frequently, perhaps even do just a couple check-ins off camera to do exactly what I'm doing here, which is to stir the material around, to aerate it, to get the more damp stuff that's down low out closer to the surface, and at the same time submerge the stuff that has already had a chance to dry down into the damp material so that it too can possibly suck some of the excess moisture into itself. I feel like I'd be able to work here a little bit more easily if I wasn't so close to being at capacity. But when I'm working this close to the rim, I always worry that I'm just going to have sort of a lapse in attention and then wind up pushing a couple handfuls of this material over the edge, creating a big mess and a cleanup chore after the fact, which I just don't need. So I am going about this a little bit slow and careful, and I am very pleased to say that even though the stuff does feel pretty damp, and when I pull it up it feels kind of stuck together and clumpy still, it certainly doesn't feel quite as bad as it was last time we were in here. And to call it bad is sort of just a very subjective way of considering it, because I think from the worms' perspective it's still quite good in terms of the moisture level being where they want it to be and everything else. So I guess I really just want to try to help promote a good, successful migration of the worms out of this material. And I think the last time we checked in, we had already allowed for about 3 weeks to pass for this process to occur. And at that time, we even acknowledged the fact that if it's going to take another 3 weeks, then that's fine, I'm not in a particular rush. Well, I think what we did right there is going to help a lot, and we're going to do the same for this system over here as well, really quick. Here I feel like I've got a little bit more space to work. This box doesn't have quite as much material in it as the other one, which I think allows me to maybe be a little bit more forthright with what I'm doing here rather than being a little bit hesitant. Okay. This stuff is also quite damp, maybe even a little bit more damp than the other stuff was. This stuff is definitely going to benefit from being tilled around like this, I think, and aerated. And I think as a result of it being more moist, I think we're even seeing possibly the higher concentrations of worms within the material. So who knows? Even though this is the older of the two systems, it is possible that the younger of the two systems will hit the finish line sooner, even though they both got started into this migration at the same time. If this system is going to take longer to dry and longer to get evacuated, then that's fine. I'm not in a rush. But I'm not going to hold back, migrating the worms out of the younger system if it's ready to go, just because this one's not ready to go. At some point we might just have to detach these two buddy bins from one another and let them go their separate ways. In fact, I think having them go their separate ways is probably in the cards anyway, because I do want to try to do something a little different with those worms over there. Those are the worms that I consider to be my my original population, or the worms that I can still trace back to the original batch of worms that I started with way back when. So I kind of treat those worms like a little bit of a special batch, and for that reason I thought I might send those worms in that tub over there off into maybe like a little session in my breeding buckets or something. I don't know. I haven't really thought it through completely yet, but I thought that might be an interesting way to possibly propagate their numbers up a little bit more, so that maybe they can be loaded into two systems in great numbers, and then I can have a somewhat larger amount of the worms that I consider to be my original worms. So I think I've managed to stir most of this stuff up. It's still kind of clumpy just from looking at it. I'm sure you could probably see the difference too, how it doesn't kind of fall apart and crumble as readily as the stuff over in the other bin. And that's fine. I think we've been observing that for some time now, so it's no big deal. But I think we're at that point where we can make our way over into the feeding area, the so-called horizontal migration feeding zone, if you will. And we can start to get a little sense of how our attempt at migrating the worms is progressing over here. Good number of worms hanging out. I think the stuff we threw in here last time when we replenished this feeding zone 11 days ago was stuff like the leaves of Brussels sprouts and stuff like that. Stuff that I really didn't expect to last all that long. And I believe that might have also in part been one of the reasons I thought it would be a good idea to get back in here and at least give them a little something to hold them over until such a time that we we can eventually really focus on these little guys and get them relocated into a new home. But I'm not going to do so until I feel like we've got a pretty good amount of the worms out of the finished castings and assembled in the horizontal migration feeding zone and ready to be relocated. Now in this system it does almost seem like we might have somewhat greater turnout over in the horizontal migration feeding zone, or at least it sort of looks that way to me. These would have both been fed the same sort of foods, and I don't see any leftovers here either, which is pretty much what I was expecting to find when I came into these systems. So the only thing I'm really doing is sort of creating a little bit of a void over on the very far end, furthest away from the finished castings. That's where I usually like to replenish, add extra bedding, add extra food, so that we can keep this migration of the worms going. Alright, I've managed to get a bunch of filth all over my hands, but it's not a big deal. As long as I've got a finger that I can control the camera with, I'm in good shape. But I do try to keep one hand clean so I can handle the electronics and stuff that needs to be touched and handled with clean hands, and limit the dirty work to the gloved hand. But sometimes it just seems like I can't resist reaching over with my clean hand to lend a hand and help out with something I'm trying to do that's not working quite as well as it could. So let's see, I think I've got enough here to sprinkle a little bit of coffee in to the feeding zone in both of these, but I also want to save enough so that we can feed a couple other systems too. Those systems, on the other hand, I think really are going to be in the need for some additional food, because I think all they got last time when I checked in on them was just some coffee, and it seemed like a kind of a lightweight feeding. There again, I'm just basing these recollections on a quick breeze through of the 2 videos that I had prepared of these systems when I last fed them. And when I breezed through the video of the other bins that we're going to feed momentarily, it did seem like what they got would probably be also gone by this time. So we're going to drop in just a little bit more bedding, I think, just to cover up the coffee and worm chow and to help level things off a little bit. And with that, I think we're going to be in pretty good shape here to permit these migrations to continue. And we're going to cover up just the way we found it when we arrived in here. We're going to bring back the plastic coverings, which are meant to keep the moisture down in the feeding areas. And the plastic coverings will not be used out here over the castings, so that the castings can continue to dry now that they've been tilled up and aerated a little bit. So let me cut the camera for just a moment, get these bins out of here, and we'll feed the other 2 next. Okay, so unlike the first 2 bins, the ones that we're feeding now are kind of twin bins because they're the same age, they've got the same worm count, all that other sort of stuff. Those other 2 bins that we just dealt with, they had different ages, they were fed different amounts of times, and they probably got butted up at some point later in the game. Here, these 2 have been running side by side from day 1, and I guess the main difference that you can tell right away just from looking is one of the bins is covered with plastic, bin number 1 over here, and bin number 2 is not. And you could probably guess why. Very similar reason to what we saw before. The reason is to allow bin number 2 an opportunity to kick off a little bit of what I think to be excess moisture, whereas bin number 1 I felt was in pretty good shape and could just be covered right back up last time. So I guess I'm curious to see how we did. Let's just get these babies uncovered so we can get them fed. Now here, I guess the little wormies hanging out on the paper here in bin number 1. I guess we could try to evict some of them. Come on, guys. Give me a break. It's late. I want to get to bed. I gotta leave early in the morning. I'll be taking this footage with me, and I think I should have some time here and there while I'm away to put together a video, but I don't want it to be a War and Peace length saga. I'd like to be done with this already, so we're not going to get too fancy here. We don't have like horizontal migration feeding zones and everything like that here. I think we could just sort of dive right into where we've been feeding, which is right down the middle, and that's what these coffee filters are indicating, where the feeding zone was. And the feeding zone is typically right down the middle in most of my systems. You can see a cocoon rolling around right there. It's just that when I'm migrating worms, it's usually at that point I tend to shift to trying to get the worms to one edge of the bin and have them exit their finished castings on the opposite end of the bin. So now, since what I fed last time was just coffee, I Doubt we're going to see anything that resembles leftovers in here either. So let's just go ahead and open up these feeding zones so we can plop in the portion and be done with these little guys. Get them back up on the shelf and let them continue. There, I mean, leftovers, yeah, there's like a pumpkin stem. Pumpkin stems are almost just like test objects, you know. They're hardly the type of thing you would really consider to be everyday worm food. I just like to put stuff like that into the bins so that we can gradually observe the breakdown process, which in the case of a pumpkin stem usually does take quite some time. I'm just noticing little things that look like mold growing here and there. Almost wondering if we might have fed bread at one point, once upon a time, in these bins for it to be moldy like that. So now those other worms were red wiggler worms. These, on the other hand, are worms that I got from the crazy worm lady years ago. And I've always treated them as if they were African night crawlers, because that's what I was given cocoons to. And I did attempt to sort of keep them separate from other worm types, but I felt like in the very beginning I didn't do a great job at it. So it's for that reason I often kind of skeptically refer to the types of worms I'm running in these bins as being kind of quote-unquote African night crawlers, because I couldn't even tell you for sure if that's what they are or not. But since that's what I was told they were in the beginning, and despite the fact that I was kind of careless with keeping them separated from other worm types, I still like to just refer to these as African night crawlers as well. Alrighty, I think we've opened up a adequate space for these little guys to get their next feeding. And it's going to look a lot like they got in the other two bins, just some fresh bedding, which the African night crawlers really do appreciate. So I'm sure they're going to see the bedding itself as being pretty much a food source on its own. Not to mention the fact that these batches of my prepared bedding have lately been increasingly higher and higher concentration of leaf content. I've always tried to include a little bit of leafy matter in my prepared bedding, just sort of as a material to help the pieces of paper and cardboard remain separated from each other. And I think also because the worms, I believe, really do like the leaves as well. And more, I've been gradually upping the amount of leaves I use in my prepared bedding, because I've just got so much of it. Why not? Might as well use it, right? And I believe the worms do really appreciate it. So a lot of times I'll go digging through the rest of the bins just to examine how other portions of the bin look, such as the outskirts of the bin beyond where the feeding zones are. But today we're not going to spend time on that because I've got to call it a day. So I think we're just going to kind of leave it at that. Let's blend some of this worm chow in with the coffee and in with the bedding right beneath it. And now I think my conscience is clear. I think we can just let the worms go for another little while longer without me worrying that they're out of food. So that coffee filter that was marking where we last fed in this container looks pretty far gone, but luckily I've got a replacement, so we'll use that. And let's see what else. We had some stems of pumpkin. Let's make sure those are down in the feeding area as well, and then I think we can cover up. Alrighty, alright, look at that. Good number of worms hanging out here. I'm just trying to make a decision here as far as how to cover up. Is it necessary to keep on airing this thing out with kind of light coverings with just paper only again? Or would it be a good idea at this point to restore the plastic to this one? I guess it was just in pursuit of an answer to that question that I thought it was maybe a good idea to till up just a little bit over here in the bin where we felt like things were perhaps excessively damp to see if we still feel that that's the case. Who knows, maybe we'll just do a little tilling up of the other bin too, as long as we're trying to do things in a consistent fashion. When I bring the bins up like this side by side, I feel like if I'm doing something in one of the bins, I should really be doing it in the other bin as well, so that I get that sense like I'm just working in one large bin. So why don't we do exactly that? I think I will go ahead and go with paper only again over here to cover up, so that we can continue to lose moisture a little bit more. Here too, I think we're good as is in terms of covering up the way we found the system when we arrived. Restoring the plastic coverings, although I kind of wonder if maybe we would benefit a little bit in here too by skipping the plastic coverings and going with paper only in here too. Let me just see what things out here look like. See, I mean, things just feel like they crumble a little bit more readily, telling me that additional drying might really not be necessary here. So I think we're gonna cover up again pretty much the way we found them when we arrived. So that means restore the feeding zone indicators, come back on with the coverings pretty much the way we found them, which was paper only over here, I believe, right? And then paper plus plastic covering over here, and the other plastic will just remain in the sidelines, sort of on standby for some point in the future when we just decide that it's necessary to use it again. All right, I think we're done here. I got some stuff to clean up and some stuff to put away, but I'm not going to keep you around for that because that's boring. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's really appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.